The gun was already drawn when Lucy Ellsworth slammed both palms flat on the saloon table and looked Thomas Keene dead in the eye. "You told me you would never ask again," she said, her voice low and shaking with something that was not quite fear and not quite fury but lived in the dangerous country between the two. "You gave me your word." Thomas Keene did not flinch. He never flinched. That was the thing about him that had undone her from the very first moment. She had seen him standing in the red dust of Caldwell, Kansas, with the late summer sun hammering down on the brim of his black hat, and that jaw set like a man who had already decided every important thing about the world, and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. He stood now the same way he always stood, one thumb hooked in his gun belt, the other hand resting loose at his side, his gray eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made the crowded saloon around them feel like it had ceased to exist entirely. "I am not a man who asks twice," he said. The room went silent. 3 card players at the nearest table laid their hands face down without being told. The barkeep found something very important to study on the underside of the counter. A traveling preacher near the door quietly folded his pamphlets and slid them into his coat. Thomas Keene held Lucy's gaze for one long, agonizing beat, and then he asked again. "Lucy Ellsworth," he said, and his voice dropped to something she had never heard from him before, something raw and stripped of every wall he had ever built. "Will you marry me?" It was not a question the second time. It came out like a confession, like something dragged from the deepest chamber of a man who had spent 30 years teaching himself not to need anything or anyone, and who had just discovered, standing in a dusty Kansas saloon with a woman staring at him like he had lost his mind, that he had been wrong about himself his entire life. Lucy's breath left her body in a rush. This is where we must go back. Because to understand why that moment shattered her, and why the words she finally spoke changed the trajectory of everything, you have to know how they arrived there. You have to know about the dark past that had followed Lucy Ellsworth across 3 states and 2 territories. You have to know about the hidden motive that had first brought Thomas Keene to her door. You have to know about the betrayal that had very nearly destroyed them both before they had been given the chance to find each other. And you have to know about the trap that had been set long before either of them understood they were walking into it. It was the spring of 1882, and the cattle town of Caldwell, Kansas, sat right on the edge of the Kishom Trail like a last outpost before the world became something rougher and more honest. The Santa Fe Railroad had arrived 3 years prior and brought with it the usual assortment of characters that a railroad always dragged in its wake: speculators, gamblers, land agents, preachers, and men who had left something behind somewhere and were hoping distance would do what conscience could not. Caldwell had a reputation. It had seen enough blood on its main street to give the dust a permanent rust-colored tinge in the imagination. And the law there was the kind of law that worked hard on Sundays and looked the other way on Saturdays. Lucy Ellsworth arrived on the eastbound train from Dodge City in the first week of April with 2 carpet bags, a leather satchel that she kept pressed to her body like it contained something more valuable than her own life, and a look on her face that dared anyone to ask her a single personal question. She was 26 years old, dark-haired, with sharp brown eyes that catalogued a room the moment she entered it and filed every detail away with a precision that most people never expected from a woman, and that Lucy had learned over hard years to conceal. She took a room at Mrs. Holt's boarding house on Commerce Street, paid 3 weeks in advance in cash, and told Mrs. Holt her name was Lucy Wells. The name she used did not matter. The secrets she carried did. She had left Dodge City under circumstances that she did not discuss with anyone, which is to say she had left it in the middle of the night with her bags packed, and her heart hammering because a man named Devlin Cross had discovered that Lucy Ellsworth was not, in fact, the simple seamstress she had presented herself, as for the 8 months she had spent quietly gathering evidence of his fraudulent land schemes, and his very much illegal operation of moving stolen cattle across the Colorado line and selling them to a buyer in Wichita who did not trouble himself with questions of origin. Devlin Cross was not a man who accepted being outmaneuvered with any grace. He was a man with money and connections, and a mean streak that ran all the way down to his boots, and he had sent 2 men after Lucy before she had even cleared the Dodge City station. She had lost them in Liberal, picked up a new ticket under the Wells name, and ended up in Caldwell because she had needed to stop moving and start thinking, and because the leather satchel pressed against her ribs contained documentation that, if it reached the right hands, would put Devlin Cross behind bars for the rest of his natural life. The problem was that she was not sure whose hands were the right ones anymore. The marshal in Dodge City was Devlin Cross's first cousin. The county sheriff had taken supper at Cross's table twice a month for the past 2 years. The land office agent who had originally hired Lucy to investigate the fraud, a man named Harrison Pruitt, had stopped answering her letters 3 weeks before she fled, and she had reason to believe that someone had gotten to him too, either through money or through fear, and both were equally effective in her experience. She needed time. She needed safety. She needed someone she could trust, and she had come to Caldwell almost by accident, and she was there alone with her secrets and her evidence, and the very specific kind of loneliness that settles into a person when they have been afraid for so long that they have forgotten what it felt like not to be. She did not expect Thomas Keene. Thomas Keene was the Deputy Marshal of Caldwell, which was, she discovered within 48 hours of arriving, a position he held largely because no one else with any competence had wanted it. The previous marshal had retired to a farm in Missouri, following a gunshot wound to the thigh that had convinced him his relationship with law enforcement had run its natural course. The town council had appointed Keene on an interim basis 6 months prior, and he had proved himself competent enough that the interim label had been quietly dropped without any formal ceremony, which suited him because Thomas Keene was not a man who placed much value on ceremonies of any kind. She saw him first through the window of the boarding house dining room. He was crossing the street with that particular economy of movement she would come to associate entirely with him, never a wasted step, never a gesture that did not mean something, and he was speaking to a man she did not recognize in a tone that was clearly definitive. The other man nodded twice, quickly, and moved away faster than seemed strictly dignified. Mrs. Holt appeared at Lucy's shoulder with a coffee pot. "That's Thomas Keene," Mrs. Holt said, following her gaze with the comfortable familiarity of a woman who had been observing the main street of Caldwell for 20 years and felt entitled to provide commentary on it. "Deputy Marshal, good man, quiet. Too quiet, some say, but I have always thought that the men who talk the most are usually saying the least, so I will take the quiet ones any day." "Does he have family?" Lucy asked, and then felt immediately foolish for asking, because it was not the question she had meant to ask and she did not understand why it had come out. "Wife passed 4 years ago," Mrs. Holt said, without particular drama, the way people in small towns relay the tragedies of their neighbors, as facts of the landscape rather than sources of ongoing grief. "Fever. They had no children. He moved here from somewhere in Texas, I believe. Does not talk about it." Lucy watched him disappear around the corner of the Mercantile. She told herself she was noting his position in the town because she needed to understand the law enforcement structure of Caldwell if she was going to make a decision about who, if anyone, she could approach with her evidence. This was a practical assessment. It had nothing to do with the way he moved. She repeated this to herself several times over the following 3 days, during which she did not speak to him. The 4th day, he knocked on her door. She opened it with her hand near the small pistol she kept in her apron pocket, because 4 days of being in a new place had done nothing to quiet the alarm that lived permanently in her chest these days, and found Thomas Keene standing in the hallway with his hat in his hand and his gray eyes doing exactly what she had noticed they always did, which was see more than people expected and give away less than they saw. "Miss Wells," he said. She noted that he used the false name and felt a cold slide of alarm that she did not show on her face. "Deputy," she said, "I wonder if you might spare a few minutes." He did not ask it like a question. He stated it like an agenda item. "I have some questions I would appreciate you answering." "Questions about what?" His eyes held her steadily. "About why Devlin Cross has 2 men asking after you in 3 different towns between here and Dodge City." The alarm became something significantly more acute. She kept her expression level, which cost her more than she allowed herself to show. "I do not know anyone by that name," she said. "Miss Wells," Thomas Keene said, and there was something in his tone that was not unkind, which surprised her. "I have been a lawman long enough to know when a person is carrying something too heavy to be carried alone. I am not your enemy. But I will need more than that answer if I am going to be of any use to you." She studied him for a long moment. She had learned, through hard experience, that trusting people was a trap. She had learned that hidden motives were everywhere, that charm was often a weapon, that the people who presented themselves as helpers were frequently the ones with the most to gain from your ruin. But there was something about the way Thomas Keene stood in that hallway, hat in hand, with no particular performance in his face and no pressure in his voice beyond a flat and honest directness, that made her think he was not performing anything. "You had better come in," she said, and stepped back from the door. She told him almost everything. Not quite everything, because even then, even in those first minutes of that first conversation, she understood that Devlin Cross had long arms and that trust was something you extended in increments, not in wholesale lots. She told him about the investigation, about Harrison Pruitt's original commission, about the land fraud and the stolen cattle. She told him about the night she had fled Dodge City. She told him about the 2 men she had lost in Liberal. She did not tell him about the full contents of the satchel, or about the 3rd piece of evidence she carried, the one that connected the stolen cattle operation not just to Devlin Cross, but to a federal land agent in Wichita whose name, if spoken aloud in the wrong company, had a way of making people disappear. Thomas Keene listened to all of it without interrupting once. This was a quality she would later identify as one of the things she loved most about him, the capacity to truly listen, to take in information without rushing to speak over it, which was a rarer thing in men than anyone seemed to notice. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The 2 men Cross sent," he said. "Do you have descriptions?" She gave them to him, precise and detailed, because she was good at that kind of observation. It was what had made her effective as an investigator, and she watched something shift very slightly in his expression. "I believe one of those men may have arrived in Caldwell yesterday," he said. "Tall man, mustache, bay horse." Her stomach dropped. "Yes." "All right," Thomas Keene said, and stood up. He placed his hat back on his head with a deliberate motion that meant, she would learn, that he was moving from a thinking posture to an action posture. "You will not use the name Wells anymore. You will be Lucy Ellsworth, and you will tell Mrs. Holt your name was mistakenly written down on the register, and she will not question it because she never questions anything I ask her not to question. You will go about your business as normally as you are able. The man with the bay horse is going to find Caldwell very uncomfortable in the next 24 hours. And the second man, he is not here yet. When he arrives, we will deal with him then." He said it with such complete absence of drama that she almost believed it was simple. Almost. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, because she had learned to always ask that question. Thomas Keene paused at the door. He turned back and looked at her with those gray eyes that held their own counsel, and she thought for a moment he was not going to answer. "Because you are in trouble through no fault of your own," he said, "and because Devlin Cross has been running his operation long enough that it has reached into 3 counties that fall under my jurisdiction, and I have been looking for a way to address that for the better part of a year." He paused. "And because the manner in which you kept your voice perfectly steady, while you told me all of that, while clearly being afraid, struck me as remarkable." He left before she could respond to that last part, which was probably intentional, and Lucy Ellsworth stood in the middle of her borrowed room in a boarding house in Caldwell, Kansas, and felt something loosen very slightly in the center of her chest. Not enough to be called relief. Not yet, but something. The man with the bay horse left Caldwell the following morning in a condition of some urgency that Thomas Keene never fully explained, but that Mrs. Holt described to the other boarders as the deputy having a quiet word, in a tone that suggested the word had not been entirely quiet. The man did not return. The second man arrived 4 days later. Lucy saw him from across the street before Thomas Keene did, because she had been watching for him with the specific vigilance of someone who understood that her freedom, and possibly her life, depended on seeing threats before they materialized. He was a compact, nondescript man in a brown coat, exactly the kind of person designed to be overlooked, and that was precisely what made him dangerous. His name, she knew from her time in Dodge City, was Causey, and he was very good at finding people who did not want to be found. She went directly to the marshal's office. Thomas Keene was at his desk with a stack of wanted circulars and a cup of coffee, and he looked up when she came in and took in whatever was on her face without requiring an explanation. "Which one?" he said. "Causey. Brown coat. He just came off the afternoon stage." Thomas Keene stood up. He was taller than she remembered every time she saw him again, which was a curious thing, as if her memory consistently failed to account for the full reality of him. He took his gun belt from the hook by the door with the same economy of motion she had noticed from the boarding house window, and he said, "Go back to Mrs. Holt's. Lock your door. I will come by this evening." "You cannot just run him out of town," she said. "He will come back. Causey always comes back. He is thorough." "I know," Thomas Keene said. He paused with his hand on the door frame and looked back at her, and there was something in the look that was not quite the professional assessment she had been receiving from him for the past 4 days. It was something more personal and more careful, as if he were measuring a distance he was uncertain he was entitled to cross. "I am not going to run him out, Miss Ellsworth. I am going to make sure he has something to report back to Devlin Cross that is not your location." She understood what that meant. He was going to misdirect Causey. "Give him a false trail. That is dangerous," she said. "If Cross believes you gave him false information deliberately, he will come for you. Then I suppose we had better make sure Devlin Cross does not remain in a position to come for anyone much longer," Thomas Keene said, and walked out. She stood in the marshal's office for a moment after he left, surrounded by the smell of coffee and old paper and gun oil, and she put her hand flat on the desk where he had been sitting and thought, with a clarity that frightened her, that she was in very serious danger of trusting this man. She was not entirely certain that frightened her for the right reasons anymore. He came by Mrs. Holt's that evening as he had said he would. He sat in the parlor rather than her room because Mrs. Holt's establishment operated on the firm principle that unmarried men and women did not share rooms without a witness to propriety, and Thomas Keene respected this without being asked to. He told her in his direct and economical way that Causey had been given to understand that Lucy Wells had moved on to Newton 3 days ago, and that he had accepted this information and would likely be on tomorrow's stage north. "How did you convince him?" Lucy asked. "I did not. I found him a convincing source." "Who?" "A woman named Rose who works at the Prairie Queen Saloon and who has a particular gift for persuasive storytelling when the incentive is sufficient." Lucy looked at him. "You paid someone to lie for me." "I paid someone to perform a service," Thomas Keene said, with the faintest possible adjustment of his expression that might, in a man with a more expressive face, have qualified as a hint of amusement. "Rose is very professional. And when Causey reaches Newton and finds no Lucy Wells, Devlin Cross will conclude you moved on, possibly to Wichita, possibly further east. He will redirect his attention accordingly." He paused. "This buys you time, Miss Ellsworth. It does not solve your problem." "I know," she said, My problem is solved when that evidence reaches the right authority. Tell me about the evidence." She hesitated. This was the moment she realized. The incremental extension of trust. She had given him a good deal already, and he had handled it without exploitation and without betrayal. Everything he had done in the past week had been exactly what he said he would do, no more, no less, and she had not found a single crack in the consistency of it. She was a woman who had spent years detecting the cracks in people. She was very good at it. She told him about the satchel. She told him about the full contents, the land deeds with forged signatures, the cattle tallies with their true origins documented in a former Cross employee's handwriting, the letters between Devlin Cross and a man in Wichita named Gerald Rowe who held a federal appointment and who had been facilitating the sale of stolen beef to a government contract buyer for the better part of 2 years. The name Rowe produced a visible, if brief, reaction in Thomas Keene's face. "You know that name," Lucy said immediately, because she was watching him with the professional precision she applied to everything. "Yes," he said, "I do." He was quiet for a moment. "Gerald Rowe is connected to a separate matter I have been investigating, a matter that I was told 14 months ago had no actionable evidence." He looked at her steadily. "You have actionable evidence." "I have more than actionable evidence," Lucy said. "I have a signed letter from Rowe to Cross discussing the specific cattle deliveries by date and volume and price. If that letter reaches a federal marshal or a judge who does not have a financial relationship with either of those men, Rowe and Cross are finished." Thomas Keene was quiet for a longer moment this time. She could see him thinking, not frantically, but with that deep, methodical deliberateness that she had come to associate with how he approached everything. "There is a federal circuit judge," he said slowly, "named Aldous Carmichael. He holds court in Topeka and in Wichita on alternate months. He is the most honest man I have ever had reason to evaluate in a professional context, and I have reason to have evaluated a good many. He is due in Wichita in 6 weeks. 6 weeks is a long time to stay hidden," Lucy said. "You are not going to stay hidden," Thomas Keene said. "You are going to stay here in Caldwell as yourself under my protection, and we are going to proceed as though you have nothing to fear, because the moment you behave like a person in hiding is the moment someone starts looking for a person in hiding." She looked at him for a long time. "That is a considerable thing to offer." "It is a practical arrangement," he said. He said it carefully, like a man choosing words with some deliberateness. "It is not entirely uncomplicated in terms of how it will appear to the town. A woman alone under the protection of the deputy marshal. People will talk." "Let them," Lucy said, and was mildly surprised to hear the certainty in her own voice. "I have survived worse than people talking." Something shifted in his gray eyes at that. It was subtle, the way everything with Thomas Keene was subtle, but she had been watching his face long enough by now to read the shifts when they happened, and what she read in this one made something warm and complicated bloom in her chest, which she firmly told herself was gratitude. It was not entirely gratitude. They established a practical routine over the following weeks. Thomas Keene included Lucy in his working day in a way that was both useful to her, and she gradually understood, genuinely useful to him. She had a talent for organization and analysis that he acknowledged without ceremony, simply by beginning to involve her in the process of assembling the case against Devlin Cross from her end, cross-referencing her documents with his own investigations, building a structure of evidence that was becoming, piece by piece, formidable. She sat across from him at the desk in the marshal's office on many afternoons, while Caldwell went about its business around them, and they worked with the focused cooperative efficiency of two people who have discovered that their minds operate in complementary registers. And she found herself looking up from a document sometimes to find him already looking at her, and they would both look away with a speed that had its own kind of eloquence. She was not foolish enough to pretend she did not know what was happening. She was, however, sufficiently cautious to be very careful about it. Thomas Keene was careful too. She could see the care in him, the deliberate maintenance of a respectful distance, the absence of any pressure or implication. He treated her with a seriousness that she found, paradoxically, more affecting than any less disciplined approach could have been, because it suggested that he understood her as a complete person rather than simply as a problem to be managed or an opportunity to be pursued. He walked her back to Mrs. Holt's each evening. He did not reach for her hand. He did not say things that required her to navigate around them. He talked to her, actually talked, about the town and the case and the political landscape of Kansas and about books, because it turned out that Thomas Keene read extensively, which was one of the things she had not expected, and that had rearranged something in her understanding of him on the evening she had noticed the stack of volumes on the corner of his desk. They talked about books. They talked about Texas, and she learned obliquely, because he was not a direct teller of his own history, that he had left there after his wife's death, that the landscape had become unbearable to him, filled with the shape of a grief he had not known how to inhabit, and that he had come to Kansas because it was somewhere else, and somewhere else was all he had needed it to be at the time. She told him, in exchange, about Boston, because she was from Boston originally, which surprised people who expected her to be from somewhere with more dust. And she told him about her father, who had been a newspaper editor, and who had taught her that the most important thing a person could do was find out the truth about something, and then tell it accurately, and about how that belief had carried her west when the opportunities in Boston had been insufficient to hold her, and about the 2 years she had spent in Missouri, and then in Kansas, learning the particular kind of investigative work she had been doing when Devlin Cross's operation had first come to her attention. She did not tell him about the man in Missouri, the man who had seemed trustworthy and had been a hidden motive in human form, who had used her affection for him to extract information he had passed to the people she had been investigating. That betrayal had cost her the investigation, her position, and something harder to name, some foundational belief she had held in her own ability to read people correctly. She told him about it eventually. Not yet. The complication arrived in the 4th week. It arrived in the form of a man named Elliot Crane, who rode into Caldwell on a fine roan horse, with the particular bearing of someone who considers himself considerably more important than his immediate surroundings would suggest, and who checked into the town's better hotel and announced himself within 24 hours as a land agent from Wichita looking to survey property in the area on behalf of a private investment concern. Thomas Keene watched him from across the street with an expression that was not his professional expression. It was something older and harder. "Do you know him?" Lucy asked, because she was beside him and she had been watching Keene's face. "No," Thomas Keene said. "But I know what he is." "What is he?" "He is someone's eyes," Keene said, "and I would like to know whose." They found out inside of 3 days. It was Lucy who found it, because Lucy was the one who had spent 8 months developing the particular skill of finding things that had been deliberately concealed. She was in the hotel dining room one morning when Crane sat down 2 tables away with a cup of coffee and a folded paper, and she observed him without appearing to, which was a skill she had honed to genuine artistry, and she saw him write a brief note on the back of the paper and fold it and pass it to the boy, who cleared the tables with the ease of a man who had done this kind of thing before. She followed the boy. The boy delivered the note to the stage depot. Lucy lifted the note from its intended envelope with a deftness she had learned from a woman in Kansas City who had learned it from someone considerably less reputable, and she read it in the alley behind the depot with her heart sitting high in her throat. The note was addressed to Gerald Rowe. The note said, "She is here. Confirm cross purposes or proceed." Lucy walked very quickly back to the marshal's office. Thomas Keene read the note once and then set it on the desk and looked at the far wall for a moment. "Cross purposes," he said. "Rowe and Cross may be working at odds," Lucy said, because she had been thinking quickly the whole walk back, running the implications through the analytical structure she applied to evidence. Or Crane is asking Roe whether to move against me in ways that conflict with whatever Cross wants. Cross wants me found and silenced. Roe may want the evidence specifically before I am silenced. He needs to know how much I have. So Crane is Roe's man, not Cross's. I believe so. Thomas Keene stood up. Then we have a problem that is larger than Devlin Cross alone. I know, Lucy said. I have known since I left Dodge City. I did not tell you the whole of it immediately because I needed to be certain I could trust you. He looked at her. And now you are certain. Yes, she said, and the simplicity of her own certainty in that moment was something she felt as a physical thing, a settling, a coming to rest. Something moved through his expression then, something that was not the careful professional control he habitually maintained, something warmer and more personal that he reined in quickly but not quite quickly enough. We need to move the timeline, he said. 6 weeks is too long. We need to reach Judge Carmichael sooner. He is in Wichita in 3 weeks, Lucy said. If we can get the evidence to him before Crane reports back to Roe and before Cross finds out where I am, we cannot send it by post or by messenger, Thomas Keene said. It has to be carried directly. I will carry it, Lucy said immediately. No, he said, with a firmness that was not unkind but that was absolute. Thomas, she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and it stopped them both for a moment because it felt like crossing something. She pushed through it. I am the one who collected this evidence. I am the one who knows every piece of it and can speak to its provenance and authenticity before a judge. I am the one who has to go. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see the war in him, the lawman who understood the logic of what she was saying and the man who had been standing increasingly close to something he was not yet ready to name, and the two were in direct conflict. Then we both go, he said. You cannot leave Caldwell. I can appoint a temporary deputy. The town council has been pushing me toward it for months in any case. They want someone to cover the northern patrol while I am in. He stopped. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. While I am on another matter. You were already planning a trip, Lucy said. I was planning to go to Wichita, he said, regarding the Gerald Roe matter. They looked at each other. When were you going to tell me that? Lucy asked. Tonight, he said, and she believed him entirely. The crisis came the following morning, which is to say that it arrived before they had completed any of their planning, because that is the nature of crises and the particular gift they have for operating on their own schedule rather than anyone else's. Lucy woke in the gray hour before proper dawn to the sound of voices below her window, and she was at the window in seconds because she had been sleeping with her boots on and the satchel within arm's reach for weeks, and she looked down into the alley behind Mrs. Holt's establishment and saw 2 men she did not recognize speaking with Elliot Crane in the particular focused manner of people conducting business they do not want witnessed. She pulled on her coat. She was down the back stairs and around the side of the building before she had fully decided to be, moving on instinct and training, keeping to the deep shadow of the building line, and she heard clearly in the pre-dawn quiet Crane say a name she recognized. He said Thomas Keene. She stopped. She listened. What she heard made the cold of the early morning feel different, sharper, and the alarm that had been living in her chest for weeks became something much more acute and very specific. Because Elliot Crane was telling these 2 men that Thomas Keene was a problem that needed to be addressed before the Wichita journey could proceed, and that the Deputy Marshal of Caldwell had information that Gerald Roe considered dangerous, and that Roe's instructions were clear. The instructions were not about discrediting Thomas Keene. They were not about intimidating him. They were about something permanent and irreversible, and Lucy Ellsworth was already moving back toward the building before Crane finished speaking, because she had to get to Thomas Keene, and she had to do it now before dawn, before those 2 men could do anything they could not undo. She ran. She ran the 3 blocks to the marshal's office on Commerce Street in the dark, in April, with the satchel banging against her hip and her lungs burning, and her mind running 3 steps ahead of her feet, because she was thinking about what she had to say and how to say it, and whether Thomas Keene, when startled out of sleep by a frantic woman banging on the office door, would be the kind of man who reached for his gun first and asked questions second, which would be understandable and extremely inconvenient. He was not. He opened the door at the second knock, fully awake in the way of people who have spent years sleeping lightly because their work required it, and he took in her face and her breathing and the satchel and said, "Tell me," without preamble. She told him, standing in the open doorway with the dark street behind her and her breath coming in visible clouds in the cold air, and Thomas Keene listened with his hand resting on the door frame, and his face doing that thing it did where it became very still when the information was serious. When she finished, he said, "Come inside." He made a decision in the time it took her to step through the door and him to close it behind her. She could see him making it, the rapid, methodical assessment that she had watched him apply to every complicated situation and that she had come to trust as one of the most reliable things she knew about him. "We leave tonight," he said. "Tonight is 4 hours away. Then we have 4 hours to prepare," he said. He was already moving to the desk, pulling papers, the focused efficiency of a man with a plan forming in real time. "We do not go to Wichita directly. They will expect Wichita. We go to Hutchinson first by horse, not by stage, because the stage is how they track movement. From Hutchinson, we can catch the Santa Fe line north and reach Wichita without advertising our arrival. That is 3 days of travel." "Yes," he said. "Can you manage 3 days of hard riding?" She looked at him. "I came to Kansas from Boston by myself," she said. "I have been managing things considerably harder than 3 days of riding for the better part of my adult life." The faintest possible adjustment of his expression. "Yes," he said. "You have. I should not have asked." They spent the next 3.5 hours in precise, quiet preparation. Thomas Keene sent a note by way of a young man he trusted, a former soldier named Briggs who was honest and reliable, and who carried a message to Deputy Coleman Harris, the man who would hold Caldwell in Keene's absence, with instructions that were characteristically clear and contained no unnecessary words. Lucy packed the satchel with the documents wrapped in oilcloth against the weather, and reviewed every piece of evidence by the lantern light with Thomas Keene looking over her shoulder, not checking her work, but familiarizing himself with what they were carrying, because he was the kind of man who preferred to know all the facts of his situation before he was in the middle of it. Their shoulders were close together over the desk. She could feel the warmth of him. She thought, very briefly and with a kind of helpless honesty, that this was possibly the most alive she had felt in years, which was an extraordinarily inconvenient thing to realize about a man while packing evidence for a desperate 3-day journey with 2 potential assassins behind her and a corrupt federal land agent in front. She was a woman who had chosen honesty as a professional value. She tried to apply it to herself when she could. She was in love with Thomas Keene. She had been for probably 2.5 of the 4 weeks she had known him, which was fast by any reasonable standard, and which she attributed partly to circumstances, and partly to the fact that some people were simply the kind of people that made the heart arrive at its conclusions without waiting for permission. She had absolutely no intention of saying so. Not now. Possibly not ever, depending on how the next 3 days went. They rode out of Caldwell an hour before dawn with 2 horses from the livery, a pack of supplies for 3 days, and the satchel of evidence that represented, Lucy understood, the best chance that Devlin Cross and Gerald Rowe would ever face justice. The land east and north of Caldwell was flat and enormous under the early spring sky, the kind of sky that existed only in Kansas, she had come to believe, where the horizon was so far away that the sky was not a backdrop but a presence, something you moved through rather than under. The grass was coming green from the winter, pale and new, and the air was cold enough to show their breath but carried in it the particular smell of thawing earth that meant spring was arriving in earnest. They rode without speaking for the first hour, which was both practical, because sound carried in that flat landscape, and comfortable in a way that she had never experienced with another person before. the ease of shared silence between two people who did not need to fill the air to confirm the other person's presence. He rode well. She noticed this the way she had noticed other things about him. With the specific attention she gave to information, she filed away and returned to. There was the same economy in how he rode as in how he walked and how he spoke. Nothing performed or embellished, everything functional and composed. By the second hour, the sun was up and the silence had become something she wanted to say something into. "Your wife," she said, and then felt immediately uncertain whether she had the right to say it, whether they were close enough for her to have earned that conversation. He did not stiffen or look away. He looked ahead at the grass and the horizon and said, "Her name was Clara. Tell me about her if you want to." He was quiet for a moment. "She was kind," he said. She was genuinely kind, which is different from being pleasant. She wanted good things for people in a specific and practical way, not a general and sentimental one. She made the best of whatever circumstances she was in and expected the same from the people around her without being harsh about it. He paused. "She would have liked you." Lucy felt something catch in her throat. "That is a fine thing to say." "It is the truth," Thomas Keene said simply, and looked at her sideways with those gray eyes in the morning light. They camped the first night in a small hollow of cottonwoods near a creek, which offered both water and some concealment. Thomas Keene built a fire small enough to give heat without advertising their position, and they ate from the pack of supplies that included salt pork and hardtack, and a quantity of dried apples that Lucy suspected Thomas Keene had added because he thought she might want something that was not entirely about pure function. It was the kind of thoughtful small act that he performed without drawing attention to it. She drew attention to it. "You put the apples in," she said. "They do not weigh much," he said, which was not a denial. They sat by the small fire for a time after eating, the cottonwoods moving gently overhead and the creek making its small sounds, and the enormous Kansas dark around them full of stars in the particular density you could only see when you were far enough from any town to get the full effect. "You said you needed to be certain you could trust me," Thomas Keene said, without preamble, looking at the fire. "Before you told me the full extent of the evidence." "Yes. What made you certain?" She looked at his profile in the firelight. She took a moment with the answer because she wanted to give him the true one. "You never tried to manage me," she said. "Everyone who had a hidden motive tried to manage me. They were always slightly ahead of me, slightly redirecting, steering me toward what they needed from the situation. You never did that. You simply told me what you knew and what you thought and what you planned to do, and you asked me what I thought in return, and you listened to the answer." She paused. "And you treated the evidence as mine. Most men would have taken over, decided it was theirs to handle because they were the law, and I was a woman who had come to them with a problem. You never did that." He was looking at her now, the fire giving his gray eyes a warmth they did not usually have in full daylight. "The evidence is yours," he said. "You put yourself at considerable risk to gather it. It will remain yours until you choose to give it to Judge Carmichael yourself." "Yes," she said, "I know." And then, because the night and the fire and the cottonwoods and the accumulated weight of weeks of being near him had combined into something she was tired of resisting, she said, "Thomas." "Yes. I have been afraid for a long time," she said. "Of a great many things. The situation with Cross and Rowe, obviously. But also," she stopped, started again. "There was a man in Missouri. He was investigating something I was involved in professionally. I thought I could trust him. I thought I understood him. He used what I told him in confidence to compromise my investigation and protect the people I was trying to expose." Thomas Keene said nothing, which was correct, which was what she needed from him. "After that, I decided that trust was something I was done extending to anyone beyond what was strictly necessary," she said. "I was very disciplined about it, for 2 years." She looked at the fire. "And then I arrived in Caldwell." The silence was full after that. Not empty. Full. "Lucy," he said, and her name in his voice was different from how anyone else had ever said it, something in the register of it, the quality of the attention it carried. "You do not have to say anything," she said quickly, because she was aware she had said a great deal and was not certain she was ready for what he might say in return. "I know I do not have to," Thomas Keene said. "I am going to say it anyway." He turned toward her, and he was not a man who performed things, so there was nothing performed in his face, nothing theatrical, just the plain and serious expression of a man who was about to tell the truth about something important. "I have been careful," he said, "because I did not want to complicate a situation that was already complicated, and because I was not certain that what I was feeling was something you would welcome." And because he paused, and it was one of the rare times she saw him search for words. "Because what happened to Clara taught me that caring for someone is the most dangerous thing a person can do, and I had decided I was not going to do it again." "And now," she said. "And now it appears," Thomas Keene said, with a quality in his voice that was almost wry but was too genuine to be entirely wry, "that I have done it again regardless." Lucy Ellsworth looked at Thomas Keene across a small fire in a cottonwood hollow in the Kansas night, and she thought that she had spent years being very good at reading people, and that she was reading him correctly, and that what she was reading was not a hidden motive or a trap or a performance of something else, but simply a man telling her the truth about himself. She reached across the space between them and took his hand. He turned his hand under hers and held it, and neither of them said anything for a long time, and the fire burned down and the stars moved overhead and the creek kept its small sound, and it was entirely sufficient. They arrived in Hutchinson on the afternoon of the second day, having covered the distance faster than they had planned because the weather held and their horses were good. Thomas Keene purchased train tickets at the depot under names that were not their own, a precaution that he undertook with the calm professionalism of a man who had done more difficult things, and that Lucy observed with a mixture of admiration and the particular fondness she was finding increasingly difficult to keep at a sensible level. On the train to Wichita, they sat side by side, which was practical given that they needed to speak quietly about what came next, and the closeness was both practical and not at all only practical, and she was aware of him beside her with an acuteness that made the Kansas countryside passing outside the train window somewhat irrelevant. He was looking at her when she turned from the window. "What?" she said. "I was thinking," he said, "that I would like to take you to supper when this is over. A proper supper in a dining room without documents on the table and without either of us watching the door." She felt something so warm she almost laughed. "Is that all you were thinking?" "No," he said, with the directness she had come to love, "but I am attempting to proceed at a pace that does not alarm you." "Thomas," she said, leaning slightly toward him in the way the close quarters of the train permitted, "I have been alarmed almost continuously for the past month and a half. I am considerably less easily alarmed than you appear to believe." Something shifted in his expression, that warming in the gray eyes that she was learning to read as clearly as words. His hand found hers on the seat between them, and she let it, and they rode the rest of the way to Wichita with their hands linked between them and the sun coming in low through the train windows. And it was, she thought, one of the most purely peaceful hours she had experienced in longer than she could accurately measure. They found Judge Aldous Carmichael through the Wichita Federal Courthouse, which required Thomas Keene to present his credentials and explain his business with a concision that was characteristically efficient. Judge Carmichael was a lean, white-haired man of 65 with the unsentimental bearing of someone who had presided over enough human foolishness to have lost his capacity for shock, but retained his full capacity for outrage at injustice. He saw them in his chambers, not his courtroom, which was appropriate given the sensitivity of what they were presenting. Lucy laid the evidence on the judge's desk herself. She walked him through every piece of it, with Thomas Keene beside her providing the lawman's context and corroboration from his own separate investigation. Judge Carmichael read and listened, and asked precise questions that revealed a mind that was both quick and methodical, and he showed no reaction to the name Gerald Rowe beyond a slight deepening of the lines around his mouth that suggested he was less than entirely surprised. When they had finished, The judge was quiet for a moment. "Miss Ellsworth," he said, "you understand that presenting this evidence in a formal proceeding will require you to appear as a witness." "Yes," she said. "I understood that from the beginning, and you are willing to do so." "Judge Carmichael," Lucy said, "I have been carrying this evidence through 3 states and 2 territories with 2 men trying to find me, and one of them willing to resort to considerably worse than looking. I have been willing to do so since the night I left Dodge City." The judge looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was a recognition of something. He issued a warrant for the arrest of Devlin Cross before they left his chambers. He issued a separate warrant for Gerald Rowe. He retained all of the documentary evidence under seal and provided Lucy with a formal receipt that identified her as the evidentiary source, which protected her legally in a way that Thomas Keene visibly relaxed at seeing, which she noticed and stored. They walked out of the Wichita Federal Courthouse into the afternoon sun, and Lucy stopped on the steps and put her face up to the warmth of it and breathed for what felt like the first time in 6 weeks without the specific compression of immediate danger in her chest. Thomas Keene stood beside her. He did not say anything for a moment. "It is done," she said. "The first part of it," he agreed. "The legal process will take time. Cross will fight. Rowe has resources." "I know," she said, "but they do not have the evidence anymore, and Judge Carmichael has the warrants, and Elliot Crane's 2 men in Caldwell have nothing to be paid for now that the situation has changed." "No," he said, "they do not." She turned and looked at him in the afternoon sun, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something open and unhidden that the careful control of him was absent from entirely, and she thought that he was very possibly the most significant person she had encountered in the course of her life, and that this was both overwhelming and not at all a surprise. "You said supper," she said. "I did," he said. "I believe Wichita has dining rooms," she said. "It has several," Thomas Keene said. "I have a preference if you will trust my judgment on the matter." She took his arm. "Thomas," she said, "I trust your judgment on almost everything." They had supper at a restaurant on Douglas Avenue that was considerably more civilized than anything available in Caldwell, with white tablecloths and candles, and a menu that included beef and green vegetables that were not dried, and wine that Thomas Keene poured with a careful hand and slid across the table to her like an offering. They ate and they talked, without urgency or documents, about things that had nothing to do with Devlin Cross or Gerald Rowe or the legal proceedings that were now underway. They talked about Boston again, and about what she had loved there and what she had not, and about what Texas had been like when Thomas Keene had been young, before the grief had made it unlivable. They talked about the particular qualities of Kansas in the spring. They talked about books with the animated mutual enthusiasm of 2 people who had both spent significant time with literature, and rarely found someone who responded to it the same way. He told her a story about a young man he had once arrested in Laredo who had been caught stealing from a library, specifically stealing books rather than anything more conventionally valuable. And the way he told it, with that precise dry economy that was so entirely his own, made her laugh the way she had not laughed in longer than she could accurately calculate, from somewhere genuine and unguarded. And when she finished laughing, she found Thomas Keene watching her with an expression so transparently tender that she felt it in her chest like something physical. "You do not laugh enough," he said. "No," she agreed. "I have not lately." "I intend to change that," he said, and the simplicity of the intention in it, the absence of any question in it, made her look at him steadily. "Is that so?" she said. "Yes," Thomas Keene said, "if you will permit it." "Permit it," she said. "That is a remarkably formal way to say something." "I am a remarkably formal man," he said, and the hint of self-awareness in it was so entirely unexpected from him that she laughed again. And this time he smiled, truly smiled, not the faint adjustment she had catalogued from the beginning, but a real smile that changed the whole geography of his face. and she thought she would very much like to be the cause of that smile as often as possible for as long as she could manage. They returned to Caldwell 2 days later, having given statements to the federal authorities in Wichita, and arranged for the evidence to be formally processed through Judge Carmichael's office with Lucy named as the primary witness for the upcoming proceedings. Thomas Keene had sent a wire to Deputy Coleman Harris explaining that the situation with Cross and Rowe had been addressed through federal channels, and that the men in Caldwell working for those interests would have no further reason to remain, which proved to be accurate. By the time they arrived back, Elliot Crane had departed without ceremony, and the general atmosphere of Caldwell had resumed its ordinary character. They rode in from the station in the late afternoon, and Mrs. Holt watched from the parlor window with an expression of profound satisfaction that she made no effort to conceal, and Deputy Harris greeted Thomas Keene with the relief of a man who had been doing 2 jobs for 5 days and was ready to return to one. Everything was very nearly ordinary, except that something had changed between them irrevocably and mutually, and Caldwell being Caldwell, a town of several hundred people who noticed everything and discussed it with enthusiasm, this was not going unremarked. Mrs. Holt remarked on it within 20 minutes of their return. "I will simply say, Mrs. Holt told Lucy over supper with the contentment of a woman whose instincts have been vindicated, that I told you he was a good man." "You did," Lucy agreed. "And I will further say," Mrs. Holt continued, "that I have not seen Thomas Keene look the way he looked this afternoon when he was speaking to you at the depot in the 4 years since I have known him, which is to say, like a man who has come home to something." Lucy looked at her plate for a moment. "Mrs. Holt," she said. "I am not interfering," Mrs. Holt said serenely. "I am simply observing. It is what I do." Thomas Keene came by after supper, as was now entirely customary, and they sat in the parlor, and Mrs. Holt brought coffee and then found an errand that required her to be in another part of the house, which was not entirely subtle but was genuinely appreciated. They talked for a while about the proceedings in Wichita and what came next, because there was still the formal legal process ahead of them, still Lucy's role as a witness, still the months before Cross and Rowe would face a court. But underneath the practical conversation was the other thing, the thing they had been moving toward for weeks, and that was now simply present between them, acknowledged and warm and real. "I need to ask you something," Thomas Keene said. She looked at him. "Ask. Are you planning to stay in Caldwell?" He said, "After the proceedings, when Cross and Rowe are dealt with, you are a free agent. Your work brought you here, not any particular attachment to the place, and you are a woman of considerable capability who could go anywhere and do any number of things." He paused. "I am not asking you to stay. I am asking whether you want to." "What would staying look like?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. He had both hands around his coffee cup, and he was looking at her with that direct gray gaze that she had come to think of as the most honest thing she knew. "I am not a man who is good at this," he said, "at saying things of a personal nature. I speak plainly about most things, but this particular kind of plain speaking has never come naturally to me." "You have been doing quite well at it," she said gently. "I have been trying," he said, with a seriousness about it that undid her completely. "Lucy, I would like you to stay, not just in Caldwell. I would like—" He stopped. He set the coffee cup down. He looked at her hands, and then at her face with a resolution that she recognized as the same resolution she had seen him apply to the worst practical problems of his working life, and her heart was doing something very dramatic in her chest. "I am not a man who asks twice," he said, and then he asked. He asked her if she would marry him, and the asking was so plainly itself, so entirely Thomas Keene in its directness and its lack of performance, that she sat very still for a moment and simply breathed with it. "Thomas," she said. "You do not have to answer immediately," he said. "I recognize that we have known each other." "Yes," she said. He stopped. "Yes," she said again, because yes was the only honest answer there was, and she had made honesty her professional value, and now she was applying it to herself. I will marry you, Thomas Keene. And you did not need to ask twice, because you were going to get yes the first time. He looked at her for a long moment with that open expression she was learning to love, the one that appeared when his careful control had been moved by something genuine. He reached across and took both her hands. "Good," he said, and then, very quietly, "Good." They did not have a long engagement, because neither of them was particularly interested in formality for its own sake, and because the particular quality of their connection was one that had been through enough already to have established its foundations thoroughly. They were married in June of 1882 in the small church on Chestnut Street in Caldwell by a pastor named Reverend Elias Holt, who was Mrs. Holt's brother-in-law and who conducted the ceremony with a brevity that Thomas Keene had specifically requested and that Lucy found entirely appropriate. Mrs. Holt cried, which she would later deny to everyone who asked. Deputy Coleman Harris served as a witness and shook Thomas Keene's hand afterward with genuine warmth, and then told Lucy that the Deputy Marshal of Caldwell had been considerable better company since you arrived, ma'am, which Thomas Keene accepted with more equanimity than Lucy had expected, and which she filed away as one of the more endearing things she had ever witnessed. They went back to the house that Thomas Keene had been renting on the south end of Commerce Street, which was a modest but solid house with a deep porch and a good stove, and a garden that Lucy immediately began to consider the possibilities of, and which became home to her with a speed and thoroughness that surprised her. She had not had a home in a long time. She had had rooms and situations, and places she was passing through on the way to somewhere else. She had forgotten what it felt like to have a place where the weight of herself fit correctly. She remembered quickly. Devlin Cross was arrested in August of 1882 by a federal marshal operating out of Dodge City, which had a particular satisfaction to it, given that Dodge City was where his operation had been based, and where his cousin had been the marshal who had looked the other way. Gerald Rowe was arrested the following week in Wichita, which produced a considerable stir in the federal land office and a hasty review of land grant allocations going back 4 years. Lucy testified at both trials in the fall of 1882, traveling to Wichita with Thomas Keene, who sat in the gallery and watched her on the witness stand with an expression that she could not see from where she stood, but that Mrs. Holt's nephew, who had accompanied them, described afterward as like a man watching someone he is very proud of and trying not to show it, and not entirely succeeding. She was a composed and thorough witness. Judge Carmichael was a fair and rigorous presiding judge. Devlin Cross was convicted on 17 counts of fraud and cattle theft and received a sentence of 15 years at the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth. Gerald Rowe was convicted on 11 counts and received 12 years, with a separate review of his federal appointments conducted by the Department of the Interior, which was overdue regardless. When the verdict came down, Thomas Keene was waiting outside the courthouse. He had his hat in his hand in the way she had first seen him, and the afternoon sun was on him, and she walked down the courthouse steps and straight into his arms, which was where she had been navigating toward since the day she had looked through Mrs. Holt's dining room window, though she had not been able to name it then. He held her for a long moment, and she could feel his relief in the steadiness of it, the way he held on with the quiet intensity that was his particular way of being demonstrative. "It is over," she said into his shoulder. "The legal part," he said into her hair. "The rest of it is just beginning." She pulled back and looked at him. "That is either very ominous or very encouraging." "Encouraging," he said, with that faint adjustment of expression that was his version of a smile, and then he kissed her on the courthouse steps in Wichita, Kansas, in the fall of 1882, in front of Mrs. Holt's nephew and several court clerks, and a man with a newspaper who subsequently wrote a brief item about the young couple celebrating the conclusion of a significant federal case, which was accurate if somewhat understated. They returned to Caldwell as the trees along the creek beds were turning gold and red, and the town felt like the right size, the right shape, The right place. Thomas Keene was formally appointed full marshal by the end of that year, no longer interim, the title official, which he acknowledged with the same equanimity with which he acknowledged most official recognitions, which was to say he nodded and returned to work. Lucy found work of her own, which she had known she would need because she was constitutionally unsuited to remaining idle, and she found it in a way that surprised her by how naturally it presented itself. Harrison Prout, the land agent who had originally commissioned her investigation and who had gone silent at the critical moment, had in fact been coerced into silence rather than bribed into collaboration, as she had feared. When the Crossrow investigation concluded, Prout reached out to her with a combination of genuine remorse and an offer of continued investigative work through his office, now operating under much closer federal oversight. She took it. She worked from Caldwell, which was a reasonable center of operations for the region, and she traveled occasionally to Wichita or Newton or Dodge City when a matter required her presence, always with Thomas Keene's full support, and without any suggestion from him that her professional activity was in any way inconvenient to his life or his sense of how things should be, which continued to be one of the things she loved most about him. She came home from a 3-day trip to Wichita in the early spring of 1883 and found that Thomas Keene had done something to the garden, specifically had built a raised planting bed along the south wall of the house that would catch the full afternoon sun, and had filled it with soil from the creek bottom, and had left seeds on the kitchen table beside a note that said, in his economical handwriting, "The man at the seed store said these would do well in Kansas. I do not know if he is correct. I thought you might want to decide." She stood in the kitchen with the note in her hand and the seeds in their paper packets on the table, and she felt something that was very large and very simple at the same time, the feeling of being known by someone, of having your particular self seen and considered and attended to. And she thought that she was going to plant those seeds and grow things in that garden and come home to this house for the rest of her life, and it was not a small thought. He came in 20 minutes later from the evening patrol, hat first through the door, and she was still standing in the kitchen with the note, and he looked at her with his level gray eyes and said, "Too much." "Not even slightly," Lucy said. She planted the garden in April. It did well. The man at the seed store had been correct. Their son was born in November of 1883, which was the precise month that the Kansas weather became most inhospitable, which Thomas Keene observed was consistent with his general experience of important things occurring at the least convenient possible time. They named him Daniel, after Lucy's father, the newspaper editor from Boston who had taught her that truth was worth telling, and Thomas carried him around the house on that first evening with the careful, focused attention he applied to everything important, and Lucy watched from the bed and thought she had never seen him look so entirely undone by something in the best possible way. Daniel was a healthy and demanding and vocal child who had his father's gray eyes and his mother's relentless curiosity about everything, and the combination was exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Mrs. Holt called on them the day after Daniel arrived and held him for approximately 20 minutes and told Lucy she had done magnificently, which was the closest to fussing she was able to come, and told Thomas Keene that he looked entirely undone, which is precisely right, and left a covered dish that sustained them for 3 days, which was the most practical expression of affection she knew. The law in Caldwell continued to require Thomas Keene's considerable attention. The cattle trade was changing as the years passed. The Kishom Trail was being compressed by the march of agriculture and fences and the gradual civilization of the frontier, and the character of the town changed with it, slowly, the roughest edges worn down by time and settlement, and the quiet accumulation of people who had come to stay rather than to pass through. Thomas Keene adapted to these changes with the same methodical competence he applied to everything, and Lucy watched him navigate the shifting demands of his position with a pride that she expressed directly and without self-consciousness, because she had come to believe that pride in the people you loved was something worth saying aloud. He expressed it back with the same directness. He told her, not infrequently, that she was the most capable person he had ever known, and he said it in his way, which was to say factually, as an observation rather than a compliment, which made it more rather than less powerful. They had hard days. They had disagreements, because two people of strong conviction and sharp intelligence who spend all of their time together will inevitably find the subjects on which their thinking diverges, and they were both people who had strong convictions and were not inclined to submerge them. These disagreements were sometimes heated and always resolved, because they were both, when it came down to it, people who would rather reach an honest resolution than maintain a comfortable fiction, and that turned out to be the most important shared value they possessed. In 1885, when Daniel was walking and talking and conducting a vigorous campaign against the concept of bedtime, Lucy discovered she was expecting again. She told Thomas Keene over breakfast, which was a practical time for important information. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her across the table, and then he reached across and took her hand and held it, and she covered his hand with her other hand, and they sat like that for a moment in the early morning kitchen with the coffee going and Daniel making a significant amount of noise with a wooden spoon in the next room. "Good," Thomas Keene said. The same word he had said when she had agreed to marry him, with the same quality in it, the same plain weight of genuine meaning. Their daughter arrived in the summer of 1885 and was named Clara, after the wife Thomas Keene had loved and lost and who had deserved to be remembered. Lucy had suggested it. Thomas Keene had looked at her for a long moment when she did and had said nothing, and had simply pressed his forehead to hers for a moment, which was the kind of thing he did when words were either insufficient or unnecessary. Clara Keene was named correctly. She grew to be exactly like her namesake, according to Thomas Keene's description, specifically kind, making the best of circumstances, expecting the same from others without being harsh about it. The trials and the convictions of Devlin Cross and Gerald Rowe had closed the chapter of danger that had brought Lucy to Caldwell, but they had done something else as well. They had established Lucy Ellsworth Keene as someone whose investigative work was reliable and whose testimony was credible, and this reputation brought her continued work through Pruitt's office and, eventually, directly from federal authorities in Wichita who had come to know her name and respect what it meant. She worked on cases that mattered. She was careful and thorough, and she never took on work that required her to be absent from Caldwell for more than a week at a time, which was a practical boundary she had set for herself, and that Thomas Keene never suggested she should set, but that she chose because it was what she wanted, which was different. Daniel grew up knowing that his mother did important work that required intelligence and bravery, and that his father was the most respected lawman in 3 counties, and that dinner in the Keene household was frequently the most interesting conversation in Caldwell, because both his parents had strong opinions and no reluctance to share them, and a shared commitment to the idea that a child's questions deserved real answers. Clara grew up knowing the same things and drew from them the same conclusions, which were large ones. Thomas Keene and Lucy Ellsworth Keene grew older in Caldwell, Kansas, together, which was the most ordinary and the most extraordinary thing either of them had ever done. There was a night in 1887 when they sat on the porch of the house on Commerce Street after the children were asleep, and the evening was warm in the particular way of Kansas summers, and the town was settled and quiet around them, and Lucy was reading, and Thomas Keene was doing what he sometimes did in quiet evenings, which was simply existing in the same space as her with a completeness that had taken her time to understand, and that she had come to consider one of the great gifts of her life. The capacity to be fully present with someone without needing the silence to be filled. She looked up from her book. He was looking at her in the evening light, with that expression she had first seen on the courthouse steps in Wichita, the open one, the one that appeared when his careful control had been moved past by something too genuine to manage. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He considered it, the way he considered everything. "That I am glad you came to Caldwell," he said. "That I am glad Devlin Cross was foolish enough to alert you to the danger, because if he had not, you would not have needed to leave Dodge City, and you would not have needed to stop somewhere, and you might have stopped anywhere, and it might not have been here." "It might not have been," she agreed. "And I am glad," he said, "that you are a woman who can tell the difference between a man with a hidden motive and a man who simply means what he says." "I am good at it," she said, "professionally." "You are," he said. "You were right to be careful. The situation warranted it." "It did," Lucy said. She put her book down. "Thomas." "Yes. You asked me twice," she said. "You told me you were not a man who asked twice, and then you asked twice." He looked at her steadily. "Yes. I have thought about that," she said. "From time to time, why you did." He was quiet for a moment. "I had said it," he said, "for years, that I was not a man who asked twice for anything. That I stated a thing once and let it stand. It was a point of personal principle." He paused. "And then I was standing in that saloon and I had said it and I looked at your face, and I understood that there were situations in which a personal principle, however long held, was substantially less important than what it was guarding against." He looked at her with the full weight of those gray eyes. "You were more important than my pride." Lucy Ellsworth Keene looked at Thomas Keene on the porch of their house in the summer evening and felt the full accumulated warmth of 5 years of building a life with a person who was exactly who he had presented himself to be on the day she had first been willing to see him. "You know," she said, "I would have said yes the first time." "I know," he said, "but I was not certain enough in that moment that I deserved the yes." "You did," she said. "I know that now," Thomas Keene said. He reached across and took her hand, the way he had in the Cottonwood Hollow in April of 1882, with the fire between them and the stars overhead, and held it with the same steadiness. The children grew. The town changed, as towns do, shaped by the forces of time and railroad and settlement, and the slow transformation of the frontier into something more settled. Thomas Keene served as Marshal of Caldwell for 12 years in total, and was offered a federal appointment in 1893 that he and Lucy discussed for 3 evenings at the kitchen table before he declined it, because the federal appointment would have required them to leave Caldwell, and Caldwell had become the place where their life was, in the specific and irreplaceable way that a place becomes that. He took a different position instead, one that allowed him to remain in Caldwell while consulting for the federal marshal's office on the more complex cases in the region, and Lucy continued her investigative work alongside this, and the arrangement was entirely their own design and suited them exactly. Daniel Keene, at 16, informed his parents that he intended to study law, specifically because he had grown up watching his mother build cases and his father administer justice, and he had come to believe that the law was the most important structural element of a civilization that wanted to remain civilized. Thomas Keene looked at his son with an expression that managed, in its restraint, to contain an enormous quantity of pride, and said that studying law was a sound ambition. Lucy told Daniel that the law was only as good as the people who practiced it honestly, and that he should never forget that. And Daniel, who had his mother's eyes and his father's jaw and an intelligence that combined the best qualities of both, said he would not. Clara Keene, at 14, was already reading cases from Lucy's professional files and asking questions that made the lawyers who occasionally corresponded with her mother look up from their letters with expressions of mild alarm. Thomas Keene watched his daughter conduct a rigorous interrogation of a county land agent who had come to supper one evening on a professional matter, and afterward he said to Lucy, in the quiet of their room, "She is going to be formidable." "She already is," Lucy said. He smiled. The full smile, not the faint version, the real one that changed the geography of his face. "Yes," he said, "she is, like her mother." Lucy looked at him across the room, in the lamplight, this man who had been a stranger who knocked on her door in a boarding house and had become every important thing, who had been careful and honest, and had told her the truth about himself and had asked her the question twice even though he had said he would only ask once, because she was worth more to him than any principle about asking. "Thomas," she said. "Yes," he said. "I have been thinking," she said, "that we ought to go back to Wichita." He looked at her with mild curiosity. "For a case?" "No," Lucy said. "For supper. A proper supper in a dining room without documents on the table and without watching the door." She smiled. "You promised me that once, a long time ago." Thomas Keene considered this for a moment. "We have had supper in Wichita," he said. "Several times." "Not recently," she said, "and not without something pressing on the edges of it. I want to go and have supper and talk about books and come back." She paused. "Just us." He looked at her with the open expression, the one she had been reading for years now and still found as moving as she had found it the first time she had seen it on the courthouse steps. "Yes," he said simply. They went to Wichita on the Santa Fe line on a Thursday in the early autumn of 1889, 7 years after Lucy Ellsworth had first arrived in Caldwell with 2 carpet bags and a leather satchel full of secrets. And they had supper at a restaurant on Douglas Avenue with a white tablecloth and candles. And Thomas Keene poured wine carefully and slid it across the table to her. And they talked about books and about Daniel and Clara and about what they wanted for the next years. And they sat across from each other in the candlelight and were entirely at ease, which was the thing that had taken the longest to understand as the greatest luxury available to a person, the ease of being in a place where you did not have to be anyone other than yourself. They came home on Friday morning on the early train, and Caldwell was there waiting for them the way it always was, the same main street and the same dry dust and the same sky. And their house was on the south end of Commerce Street with the garden along the south wall and the deep porch and the good stove, and it was home in every sense of the word, and it had been built out of the most unlikely materials. A woman running from danger, and a man who had decided not to need anyone, and a set of circumstances that had conspired to put them in the same boarding house hallway on an April morning in 1882. The evidence of Devlin Cross's fraud had helped them find each other. The betrayal that had driven Lucy out of Dodge City had led her to the person she had been looking for without knowing it. The trap that had been laid for her had, by some irony of fate, walked her directly into the only safety she had ever found that felt entirely real. She thought about this sometimes, the way trajectories worked, the way a dark past could, if you survived it and refused to let it determine your future, become simply the road that led you somewhere worth being. Thomas Keene was worth being next to. She told him so directly because she had made honesty her professional value and her personal one. In the kitchen one morning when he was reading the paper and Daniel was already off to school, and Clara was in the garden pursuing some project that had involved considerable dirt and enthusiasm, and the house was almost quiet and the light was good. He put the paper down and looked at her. "I know," he said. "So are you." He picked up the paper again and then set it down again and said, "Lucy." "Yes." "I asked you twice," he said, because this was something that had become, in their private language, a way of saying something larger than its components. A way of saying that there had been a moment when he had chosen to set aside what he had told himself about who he was because she was more important than that. "You did," she said, and I said yes. "You did," he agreed, and I have been glad of it every day since. The Kansas morning came in through the window, and the coffee was hot, and the garden was growing along the south wall, and Daniel Keene was going to study law, and Clara Keene was already formidable, and Thomas Keene was looking at Lucy Ellsworth Keene across the kitchen table with those gray eyes that she knew better than she knew almost anything else in the world, and the story of how they had arrived here, through danger and secrets and a leather satchel full of evidence and a cottonwood hollow in the dark and a courthouse step in the autumn sun, was entirely and completely their own. Outside, Caldwell went about its business. Inside, everything was exactly as it should be, which was more than either of them had known how to ask for once upon a time, and which they both understood now was the most important thing there was to have.